The Elder Scrolls is a setting that I hold very near and dear. There seems to be a lot of magic in the world of Tamriel, but I have a question. Where exactly is all of that magic? Well, we see a lot of it while playing, but what does that mean for the setting at large? 95% or more of the magic that we see in each of these games directly relates to combat scenarios in some way. But surely there must be more to magic than that. I'm going to spend a little while yapping about magic from the perspective of the non adventurer, and I hope that by doing so you'll come to appreciate magic more and maybe even spice up your own world building, tabletop games, and creative writing. Before we get into the video proper, however, I do want to say that this video is sort of a sequel to my Magic and Daggerfall video, specifically the section on magic and game design. You don't need to watch that video, and certainly not any of the parts that go over the mechanics of Daggerfall, but it might help you understand where I'm coming from. In long-standing video essay tradition, before we talk about what I'm actually here to talk about, we need to go over some background information. If we are to be talking about magic for the non-adventurer, we first need to talk about magic for the adventurer. We need to know what exactly we are comparing to, after all. In most fantasy stories, the Elder Scrolls games included, we follow an adventurer or hero of some kind. These adventures and heroics very often involve combat in some way. That's totally fine and cool, but it is important to keep in mind our perspective and our perception of the reality of a fantasy world. For adventurers, the magics that are most useful to them are those magics which directly benefit them in their adventuring career. Weapons and armor are significantly overrepresented magical items, spells that deal damage to opponents are likewise overrepresented. And I do believe that these are overrepresented. Magic is capable of anything, at least writ large. If there are ways to utilize magic for combat, there almost certainly have to be ways to utilize magic for non combat purposes as well. If the tavern has a magical fireplace that can light with the use of a command word or some other simple activation method, the adventurer does not care, so long as that tavern has a bowl of soup and an empty bed ready for her. Likewise, she will not be curious as to the nature of this fireplace, and unless she sees it magically lit, will certainly do no investigation with respect to it. A magical sword, on the other paw, she will certainly inspect and find the uses for. It is, perhaps, for this reason of niche perspective that these more domestic uses of magic might be ignored. You are an adventurer, you have no use for these easy lighting fireplaces. These are just more things to be added to the already massive list of things which are simply outside the scope of the game. As a counterpoint to the idea that magical items of a domestic quality are simply ignored as a matter of character perspective, I want to bring up the idea that perhaps magical items of a combat oriented bent are overrepresented in the reality of a fantasy world. Magic is a thing of power, after all, and those who possess power are loath to lose it. It would make sense that those with the money and the power to patronize enchanters and mages would also be the ones most interested in weapons of war. How better to maintain your power as the Duke of the Western Lowlands than to ensure that your army is better equipped with swords that revitalize the wielder or arrows that explode or something? If magic is a rare and powerful thing, it would make sense to have this overrepresentation. If you are a power hungry noble, are you going to invest in a magical ring to protect you from poisons, or a magical plow that is lighter and harder than steel? You're going to go for the ring almost 100% of the time. Personally, though, I vastly prefer the first idea, that the reason these domestic magical items don't show up in fantasy often is simply because they're beyond the scope of what a given story is trying to accomplish, and this is the case for two main reasons. Firstly, I think that having magic be employed in these domestic use cases feels more magical. I like a world that is filled with magic, characters who are surrounded by it. And I like a world where, even if performing magic might be impossible for a majority of people, anyone could gain access to magic through some sort of magical item. I simply think that these worlds have more play to them. Secondly, I find it kind of difficult to empathize as easily with heroes. I'm just a little rat. I'm not cut out for adventure or heroics. I'm a real life support class, and I'm fine with that. I'd honestly rather be the barkeep with the easy light fireplace than the adventurer with the magic sword. There's something a lot more interesting to me about these domestic sorts of items, because they're the ones that I would like to actually own. When we're talking about magic, we have to talk about the mechanics, at least a little bit. We have to know how magic works in order to understand what it can do for us. I'm going to start with enchanting, the creation of magical items. This is not a video that's actually about any game in particular, so I'll explain how enchanting works in a couple of different games. This isn't a robust mechanical analysis either, so I'll be glossing over details. The point of this is just to demonstrate how things could work in a world, not necessarily how they actually do work in any specific world. In the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall, each item has a certain quality that determines how strong an enchantment it can hold, an enchantment budget, if you will. Each enchantment costs a certain amount of points that are used from that enchantment budget. An enchantment could cast spells when the item is used, or add a vampiric effect to a weapon when it strikes a foe. You can also add side effects, negative qualities that fortify the enchantment, allowing a higher budget at the downside of whatever that side effect entails. A side effect might be causing animals to be afraid of you, or dealing damage to you whenever the item is used. The downside to enchantment in Daggerfall is that generally using the enchanted item physically deteriorates the item, and magical items cannot be repaired. Additionally, the soul of a non person creature can be trapped in a soul gem and used to fortify an enchantment, much like a side effect. Some creatures' souls will carry with them their own innate enchantments and side effects, though this is not required to make an enchantment. In the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, much like in Daggerfall, each item has an enchantment budget. The stronger the enchantment, the higher the budget that is required. Each enchanted item can only function in three ways. It can carry a constant effect enchantment that functions all the time while the item is equipped. It can carry a cast when used enchantment that functions whenever the item is used. And if it is a weapon, it can carry a cast on strike enchantment that functions whenever the weapon hits a target. Unlike in Daggerfall, these enchantments can't be mixed and matched. If the item has a constant effect enchantment, all of the effects will be a constant effect, and so on. Also, unlike Daggerfall, there are no side effects that can be added to increase the enchantment budget. In order to create a magical item in Morrowind, a soul gem containing the soul of a creature must be used. Depending on the strength of that soul, the item will have a maximum charge level. Depending on the strength of the enchantment, the when used or on strike enchantments will use a certain amount of that charge. Constant effect enchantments don't care about the maximum charge level of the soul, but there is a minimum value of soul required to make an enchantment a constant effect. Enchanted items can be recharged by using more soul gems, but they also recover charge passively over time. This, in and of itself, would allow for a lot when it comes to domestic uses of magic. To use the easy light fireplace example again, how often do you need to light a fireplace? Presumably once per day at the most often. It's totally reasonable for a relatively weak enchantment. Simply getting a fire started, assuming there's already kindling and wood in the fireplace, could have a charge cost small enough to recharge once or twice a day. I should also note that in Morrowind there is also technically a fourth enchantment type, and that is the cast once option. This is for spell scrolls, and you can technically craft your own. This isn't really important, it's just something to keep in mind. In World of Warcraft, enchanting works very differently than in the prior two examples. Rather than creating enchantments in WoW, there is a list of discrete, already created enchantments. Some of these enchantments are more commonly known and can be taught by trainers, but some are more rare and usually more powerful, and can only be learned by finding a formula for them. Enchanting an item in WoW requires specific reagents as determined by the formula for that specific enchantment in question. By the player, these reagents are usually obtained by disenchanting other magical items, thus destroying the item and recycling its materials. Presumably, there are other sources of these reagents, but that's the primary method by which the player acquires them. If our goal as a world builder is to have a world which is suffused with magic, both fantastical and mundane, a system like Morrowind's is an excellent choice. Once a magic item is made, it will work forever. Whether it uses the arcane winds or energies from astronomical bodies like the sun or moon to recharge its power, it does recharge. If these magical items last forever, perhaps even a poor farmer could work up the money to buy one of them eventually, and make use of it for the rest of their life. The systems in Daggerfall and Morrowind are similar but distinct, and the items created from them are also similar, though distinct. However, there are plenty of different magic systems that work in vastly different ways, like that of World of Warcraft's enchanting. To directly quote my video on magic and Daggerfall that I referenced in the introduction, if you want to create a world with magic in it and you want to take it seriously, I think that you need to start with the magic. The existence of magic has real implications and the world will be shaped by it. So, for this next short section, I'm just going to mention some specific facets of enchanted items and talk just a little bit about their ramifications from a world building perspective. None of the different options for these facets are necessarily better or worse than the alternatives, but hammering out these details is how you start on the road to considering the implications of magic on your world. In some games, an enchanted item is enchanted in the moment of that item's creation, say in the forging of a sword. Those magical properties are baked into the item itself, whereas in other games, a magical item was first a mundane item, only gaining its properties through an enchantment process after its creation. I think that both systems are perfectly acceptable, but if we want to maximize magical items, then I think that this post creation enchantment is preferable. Requiring the enchantment to be a part of creating the object means that every single enchantment is much more purposeful and deliberate than in a system where any item can be enchanted, which allows for some degree of spontaneity. Furthermore, requiring an item to be enchanted during its creation requires an even higher skill floor when it comes to enchanting. Unless an enchanter can collaborate with another person, an artisan, this sort of system would require all enchanters to learn, say, woodworking if they wanted to make enchanted wooden items, and smithing for enchanted metal items. Requiring a broader set of skills for enchanted items to be made will inevitably cause there to be fewer people capable of creating them. Another similar facet is exactly when an item can be enchanted at all. Perhaps an item can be enchanted at any time. It is simply a magical art that can always be practiced. However, there also may be certain times at which enchanting becomes possible. When the sun is at its height, when the celestial bodies align correctly, when the wind is blowing from the east, etc. These are all potential timings for binding magic into an item. If enchanting is dependent on some sort of timing, then that is going to affect the quantity of magical items in a world. If that time happens very often, say every noon, then there can still be plenty of magical items. If that time happens rarely, say when the celestial bodies align correctly, then there will be much fewer. Additionally, if the time to enchant is something like the celestial bodies aligning, the amount of magical items will necessarily be greater in societies with more advanced astronomical knowledge than in those without. In all reasonable settings that I am aware of, enchanted items have some sort of power source. That power source can be anything: the direct blessing of a god, mystical runes of arcane power, a reserve of soul energy, the ability to tap into the ley lines, the power of blood, the effects of sympathetic magic, elemental affinity, invocation of the spirits, etc. Each of these power sources will necessarily work in different ways, with their own rules, advantages, and disadvantages. If your enchanted items draw their power from the sun, for example, what are the ramifications of that? Maybe culture groups on the equator have an inherent magic advantage as they have consistent access to the sun year round, though perhaps groups near the poles have a seasonal advantage. Some settings will even include a number of different power sources for enchantment. Different strategies around using these various sources of enchantment power might arise and persist differently in various environments based on material and cultural factors. To draw a very imprecise parallel to real life, I'll use cooking as an example. If you're in the Western world, you have grown up with a certain culinary culture. The ingredients, of course, but more importantly, the equipment and methods with which you are familiar are very different from those for people in, say, China. If you look up how to make an authentic Chinese dish, you will often find that not only are there ingredients you may not be able to find in a Western food market, but that you will need to cook the dish in ways which do not make any intuitive sense to you. Perhaps the most obvious examples of this are all the various techniques for using a wok, a piece of equipment which Western cuisine does not employ. Over time, small differences in material conditions and local preference in cuisine have compounded. After all, once woks are widely accepted for whatever reason, you're going to learn how to use the wok to its fullest. The reason for that is because people largely make do with what they have. In this way, you could have two or more entirely different magical traditions. Differences in material conditions could cause different power sources for enchantment to become more popular, and then, once that type of enchantment became the culturally prevalent kind, people work within those bounds, building upon what came before. People make do with what they have. If you have all the equipment and knowledge to do magic in a certain kind of way, that is what you'll do. Another element to enchanted items is actually two related facets, those being who can enchant items and where. We've already sort of discussed the how and when it comes to enchanting, and I think the why is pretty obvious magic is useful. But where exactly can someone perform enchantment? Is an advanced laboratory required, or can it be done in an open field? Do you need to be near a river, near a mountain, near a ley line? There are certainly interesting ways in which a geographical restriction can be imposed upon enchanting. Perhaps mana flows differently with certain geographical features nearby. But who can make an enchantment? Does a person need to be capable of performing magic in order to enchant items, or is it a separate art? Is anyone who is capable of performing magic also able to enchant, or is it a separately learned, more specific skill? Are the people capable of enchanting only those with a special innate gift, or could anyone learn the skill? Again, the fewer restrictions we place on enchanting items, the more there will be, and therefore the larger the impact they will have on the world we're creating. If we would like to maximize the amount of enchanted items, then enchanting should be a skill that anyone could learn, and is a trade that can be practiced anywhere with relatively minimal equipment, at least for relatively weak enchantments. And for the purposes of this video, it is weak enchantments that we want, small things, to be used on a day-to-day basis in mundane life. I think that's enough about enchantment and magical items, so let's move on to magic in the form of spells. Much like enchanting, there are so many ways to do magic, I can't possibly cover them all, so I'm going to just go over a couple of facets of the mechanics of magic. Also, remember that a lot of the questions I raised about enchanted items can also apply to casting magical spells. Firstly, in my estimation, there are two primary categories of magic. The first category is Vancian magic, and the second is spell point based magic. These are both valid ways of doing it from a gameplay perspective, and both systems are quite storied, though for our purposes in this video, I prefer the latter system. But we'll start with the former. Vancian magic is a style of spellcasting in which practitioners of magic have a discrete number of spells they can cast in a given time period, usually a day. Most often, this discrete number of spells are said to fit into spell slots, which are expended as the spells filling those slots are cast. There are often different levels of spells, with higher level of spells requiring more of those slots, or, more commonly, having their own slots that are of that level. There are also often cantrips or level 0 spells that do not require a spell slot to be expended. Spell slots are usually pretty rare, which means that there often isn't a lot of magic going around. However, that scarcity allows for magic to be more powerful on average, though for our purposes right now, we want more, less powerful magic rather than the opposite. However, you might be thinking that cantrips allow for plenty of magic, infinite magic, in fact, if there are no spell slot requirements for them, and you're right. Here's the thing though, I kinda don't like cantrips, at least from a world building perspective. The thing is that power must come with a cost associated with it. I mean, it doesn't have to have a cost, but it's pretty boring if it doesn't. Cantrips don't really have a cost associated with them, at least not one that's obvious. You could argue that only powerful practitioners could channel so easily as to make use of cantrips, but come on, we've played games. First level wizards get cantrips. You can go with the idea that most people in a world are level 0, but that just feels hollow to me, a cop out. I do really like cantrips mechanically. It makes your character really feel magical. Having the power of magic directly in your paws does feel good, and the moments that you can have as a character using it are very good. But I really don't feel like cantrips make sense from a world building perspective. Using magic without expending any sort of resource just feels unavoidably wrong to me. There is a workaround for this, however. Going to this May 1996 copy of the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition, on page 171, we have the first level spell, that's right, a first level spell, Cantrip. With a range of 10 feet and a duration of 1 hour per caster level, you can expend a first level spell slot to do minor magical acts that cannot cause damage or replicate other more powerful spells for the listed duration. This is the perfect way, in my opinion, to allow cantrips in a system that uses Vancian magic. It allows you the options that having cantrips grants you while also giving a cost to them. This cost isn't unreasonable either. Using a first level spell for the ability to cast any number of cantrips for 1 hour is perfectly cromulent. And of course, as the level of the caster increases, the longer they can use cantrips per spell slot expenditure. The primary alternative to Vancian magic is spell point based magic. Whether you call it mana, magicka, spirit, focus, will, or whether it draws directly from the practitioner's health, all practitioners have a well of some sort of resource which is expended to cast spells. All spells, no matter how small or weak, require expending some of this resource, with the more powerful spells requiring more of that resource. I think that this system has a lot of advantages over spell slots, especially for our purposes in this video. Spell points, usually measured in the dozens or perhaps hundreds, are far more granular than spell slots. This allows for much more fine adjustments in the cost of certain spells. Additionally, because all spells will have a spell point cost associated with them, that gives a tangible cost to the use of any magic, and different costs such that the difficulty of casting spells can be compared by their relative costs. If all or most people have some well of this power, even if most people have a small reserve of that power, anyone could learn very small, simple spells. Of course, there can be any number of factors that go into actually learning magic, but in theory, anyone could learn. Small, simple spells could be incredibly valuable for everyday life. There are two primary problems, in my mind, with spell points over spell slots. The first is that they are significantly harder to keep track of. Historically, pen and paper role playing games have preferred spell slots as they are simply much easier to work with. This is why spell points are much more common in video games than they are in any other medium. The second problem is similar to the first, and that is that spell slots are much easier to understand intuitively from a narrative perspective. It makes a lot more sense to say that this character can work magic 6 times per day before they've exhausted their power, than it does to say that they have 200 spell points and that their favorite spell costs 32 of them. The last facet that I want to talk about in this section is this question. What, exactly, is required for a practitioner of magic to recover expended magical energy? Perhaps it is simply an internal reserve of energy that can be recovered with rest, but there are certainly other restrictions that could apply. Much like with the creation of enchanted items, perhaps there's some sort of geographical restriction imposed upon practitioners of magic. Maybe you need to be near a ley line to recharge your magical power, or perhaps the ocean breeze is most laden with puissance. If all magic comes directly from the gods, perhaps a practitioner must spend a month in fasting and prayer in order to recharge their magical powers. There are so many decisions that can be made while building a magic system for a setting, and so many interesting consequences that can arise from those decisions. For the purposes of this video in specific, we want to focus on filling the world with many instances of small applications of magic. However, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the fact that, in many worlds, you don't want to do that. As I've said, the less restrictive the magic system, the more impact it has on a world. Almost by necessity, the more magic there is to be used, the more it will be used. If you want to build a world and make it feel right, you need to keep in mind the ramifications that will come about due to decisions you make regarding the magic system. And sometimes you will realize that the world that you've made will simply implode under the weight of those consequences. One of the points I would like to make, however, is that the sheer quantity of magic in a setting like the Elder Scrolls heavily implies that there should be plenty of the small, everyday uses of magic. We just don't see them, though. For every instance of some non-adventuring use of magic, there are 100 instances of magic directly related to adventuring. So now, after about 4,000 words of preamble, I'm finally going to talk about what the video is about. Take a moment to imagine that you are an average person, almost certainly a farmer, in a vaguely medieval setting. Think about all of the things that you need to get done in a day. Think about how those things could be made easier with magic of some sort. There are a great many ways in which magic could be deployed in a domestic setting. In order to demonstrate some of these ways, I'm going to create a non-exhaustive list of domestic spells or magical items using only spell effects from the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind, just as an example. Firstly, since I've already used it as an example, we have the easy lighting fireplace. Fire damage, maybe 5 points in 1 foot. Cure disease and cure poison are both obviously useful. People get sick from diseases all the time, and people get bitten by snakes. Feather, restore fatigue, as well as fortify strength and endurance could all be used by farmers to lighten their burdens, to get more work done, or to make the same amount of work easier. Who needs recreational drugs when you can instead light up a scroll of Calm Humanoid 27 points on self? Books of light so that you can always read, and glasses of night eye so you can see in the dark. You could make earrings of sound to act like noise canceling headphones. Another group of really obvious ones are the teleportation spells, mark recall in both interventions, as well as the mobility spells, levitation, water breathing, and water walking. I suspect that teleportation is fundamentally too powerful for most people to grasp, however, though perhaps not. And now we have a subsection where I just talk about spell effects that would see use in the bedroom. Kinky. Blind, command humanoid, and paralysis are all effects that I can guarantee would see some use in kinky fun times, though paralysis might be too powerful for your average dom. Depending on how exactly it feels to be subjected to the effects, absorb fatigue and demoralize humanoid might also get people into the subzone very well. And lastly, fire, frost, and shock damage in very small magnitudes. Talon, you stupid rat, you're likely thinking. Even 1 point of fire damage is certainly too much for your average person. And you might be right. I didn't check every single NPC, but I did check several, and the person that I found with the lowest health value is Darvaim Hlaren, the Siltstrider Caravaneer in Satanine. She is one of the 2 level 0 NPCs in the entire game and has 32 hit points. Disregarding that she's a dark elf and has 50% fire resistance, if we cast a spell at her that did a single point of fire damage on touch, she would lose 1/32 of her total hit points. Would that be too much for most people to willingly go through? Maybe. Are some people going to be willing to go through that much pain? Yeah, probably. People's is weird, man. Considering there could also be small spells of restore health, this is probably fine. We can assume, based on Darvaim being one of 2, that the average person is higher than level 0 in Morrowind's world. And health does scale with level, so most people won't be taking even a 1/32 of their health total with 1 point of damage. For the purposes of this video, though, I don't really want to go into too much depth about how much a hit point is worth. After all of that is said and done, I want to reiterate that this was a non-exhaustive list, and this was only a list of spell effects from Morrowind, a single game. One of the points that I would like to make in this video is that such a setting, with so many unique magical effects related to the adventurer's experience, surely must also possess plenty of magical effects that are more useful in everyday life. As I mentioned earlier, I propose the idea of the niche perspective of the adventurer to explain why all of these other hypothetical spell effects are absent in these games. Surely it must be the case that if there are spell effects for fire damage, spell reflection, summoning Daedra, and forming them into arms and armor, and invisibility, there must also be spell effects for cleaning floors or laundry, seasoning food, patching a hole in your roof, and who knows how many other things there could be. To recap part of what I said in the last video about magic, magic is, broadly, altering the laws of reality to accomplish some sort of goal. While magic can do anything in broad strokes, different settings will limit what magic can achieve in different ways and to different extents. Within a single setting, magic that can accomplish any goal is fundamentally uninteresting, and, as we talked about earlier, all magic must come with some sort of cost, or else it likewise be uninteresting. Given all of that, as I proposed in that video and in this one, world building a setting with magic must necessarily begin with the magic. Those limitations and costs must be considered and decided upon. Once a world builder knows what magic can do, they will be able to figure out how the world looks. This is exactly why I've been saying that it must be the case that there are magical effects that exist in the Elder Scrolls setting that we don't see in gameplay. What world would have all of those combat related spell effects and not have non combat related spell effects? What world builder would intentionally create a world like that? Neither the world nor the world builder would do it that way. As games are designed, whether they be video games or tabletop role-playing games, the overhead, the weight of the mechanics, will gradually increase as new concepts are introduced. Eventually, that weight will grow cumbersome. Some games handle this better than others, but none are immune. As that weight becomes cumbersome, some things will inevitably need to be dropped. If you're telling a story about fantastical heroes going on grand adventures, then the things that will be dropped, the things that ought to be dropped, are going to be the mundane, those things that don't contribute to that grand adventure. However, this makes the world feel less magical, I think. The world feels even more like it revolves around the players. There's all this magic in the world, but the player characters, and by extension their foes, are the only ones that have access to it? It just seems wrong to me. I want to make it clear that I have no problem with low magic settings. I think they're perfectly acceptable. But a lot of settings are not low magic, and yet I find that they sometimes feel as though they are, simply because the magic is only presented from this niche perspective. The world is fundamentally a vaguely medieval setting, and only becomes fantasy once we get into combat. And so, in order to paint a picture of a world truly suffused with magic, allow me, if you will, to describe a little slice of life. Welcome to the hamlet of Bridgeview. Bridgeview is a small, quiet town, as the bridge after which it is named, while beautiful, is not all that important of a locale. The river nearby is small, but provides a large enough flow of mana in conjunction with that from the sun to ensure that this small town is well taken care of. And a wizard has taken up residence in the town, providing the people with a means by which to access that magical power. It is the early morning, and we begin where every traveler hopes to begin their day, in a tavern. This tavern is named the Whistling Jug, and the sign out front is enchanted to cast a dim light at night so weary travelers can see. The publican got her morning started earlier than most, and brought some firewood in to start the day's cooking. Of course, the hearth includes an enchanted fire starter, making it very easy for her to do so. An hour later, the first round of breakfast is served, and the patrons are grateful for it. Unfortunately, not too long after, a crash is heard. Someone dropped a ceramic. The innkeep is quick on her paws, however, and grabs her broom. This broom has been in her family for generations. How? It is enchanted with the ability to repair its bristles over time. Unfortunately, having the ceramics repair themselves would be too far beyond her means. One of the patrons is a traveling minstrel. His goal is to collect local folk songs from throughout the lands. He's scribbling one of them down now at the bar. Two of the local farmers argue about how exactly the song goes. He's using a magical quill to write the song down, so running out of ink is not a concern. Parchment on the other paw is running out. Another patron is also a traveler. This one is an imperial surveyor, however. He is here to start the lengthy process of constructing a new road, as recent developments in the south have promised for significant economic prosperity. Atop the bridge of his muzzle are finely crafted spectacles. They are enchanted. With a command phrase, the lenses will thicken to act as a magnifying glass, in addition to correcting his eyesight. Useful for reading letters and writing reports. With a different command phrase, they will thicken even further to act as spyglasses, much more useful in his office as surveyor. This is quite a powerful enchantment, however, so he also brought a few mana pearls with him to recharge the glasses. Not everyone in the tavern is a traveler, however. Many of the locals are here to break their fasts before the labors of the day ahead. Most of these locals are farmers. Several of them, at the end of the day, retire back to their homes and cover themselves with magical cloths, which become cold to the touch when activated. This helps to soothe their aches. Now we will step outside of the tavern and explore the rest of the town. The first stop? Well, it's still kind of the tavern. The stable boy is mucking out the stalls. Terrible work, made a bit easier by a cloth wrapped around his snout, enchanted to always have a faint floral scent. Across the road from the tavern is Bridgeview's general store. The proprietor thereof doesn't deal with magical items, you'd need to visit the wizard for that, but they have a few that help them throughout their day. One is a large brush for their beast of burden. As they travel throughout the homes near Bridgeview, picking up and delivering everything they need to, their beast of burden gets a bit angsty in its advanced age. The brush is enchanted to calm the animal. Of course, a nice sugary fruit works a bit better, but its favorite kind isn't in season right now. Down the street, right on the banks of the river, are two buildings. The first is the Wizard's Tower, with all sorts of magical wonders to be had inside, too many to name. The other, however, is the home of a carpenter. Her saw is enchanted to be a hair lighter than it would be otherwise, and her plane is enchanted to hold its edge longer. Of course, she still needs to sharpen it every once in a while. At the river, we have the bridge itself, after which the town is named. The fine marble this bridge is constructed from was long ago enchanted. The effect of this enchantment is minimal. In fact, it doesn't even do anything. It simply makes the marble gleam with magic. This visual effect is most prominently experienced at dawn and dusk, and especially by those who have trained to see such things. I could continue, but I hope that you get the picture by now. Let's continue our discussion with this little slice of life held in our minds. When we begin our quest to build a world from scratch, we need to start with magic. Rules need to be decided upon surrounding what magic can or cannot do, and it needs to have a cost associated with it. So let's go over the examples given in that slice of life and discuss how just these few examples of magical items might have an effect on the world at large. The first thing established was the location of this little town and why that was significant. Mana in this world is dictated by natural energy flows. In this case, at least rivers and the sun, though perhaps there are other sources. Enchanted items have some sort of mana upkeep required to keep the enchantment working. Enchanted items presumably passively leech mana from the surrounding environment in order to do so. Likewise, mana can somehow be stored in objects called mana pearls, and those can then be used to recharge an enchantment. As for the magic itself, it was established that magic can control the shape and properties of physical matter by making them hotter or colder, lighter, transform between discrete modes of shape, maintain a specific shape more rigidly, or emit a scent. Magic can also create matter to some extent. Additionally, magic can also alter the mental state of a creature. These manipulations were not very powerful. The most powerful mentioned were the glasses that could change form in two different ways with two different command phrases. The Imperial Surveyor who possessed those spectacles brought those mana pearls with him to recharge them. Perhaps they're not strictly necessary, however. Additionally, a quill which never runs out of ink was mentioned. I would imagine such a thing would be relatively powerful, and perhaps that traveling minstrel also had a few mana pearls with him. However, perhaps not. All of these are supposed to be relatively mundane enchantments. Presumably, this is a world with high magic as well, and I'm sure there are plenty of adventurers with magic swords that do things far more powerful than smell like flowers. But during that little exercise, I wanted to ensure that the magic wasn't a solution to every problem. Sure, the plane holds its edge longer, but it still must be sharpened. The quill doesn't run out of ink, but parchment is finite. These limitations are important while world building. Could magic solve these problems in this setting? Probably yes, but perhaps that would make the enchantment that much more powerful, and thus that much more expensive. Now, this little exercise didn't go far towards defining what magic couldn't do at all. That part is harder. Of course, it can be assumed that magic can't do anything without mana, the already established power source, but what it is incapable of doing, even if you shoved as much mana into it as possible, is a different question. Perhaps magic can't affect the mind of a sufficiently intelligent and unwilling creature, or perhaps it can't transmit information across vast distances, things like clairvoyance or sending. Now, another thing that we can do with this little slice of life is take those magical items that we discussed and extrapolate them into similar items that would serve a purpose for an adventurer. This can allow us to have a more cohesive and holistic idea of what magic looks like if we are going to play a game in this world. For example, the spectacles that can change between discrete shapes. The same kind of magic could allow for a weapon shifting between two different forms, for example, a sword shifting into a mace or a longbow shifting into a spear. If a plane can be so, certainly a sword could be enchanted to hold its edge. Self-repairing shields, like the broom, would certainly be useful. Another thing that was mentioned was the magical gleam that an enchanted object demonstrates. This has implications for gameplay and would be important for the players of a tabletop role playing game to know going into the world. I didn't touch on minor spells at all in that little example, but I think y'all should be able to piece some examples together yourselves at this point, and I didn't want to waste any more time. All of this is to say, magic is really interesting. Fantasy settings have the capability to feel incredibly magical, particularly through use in mundane applications, and I think that more people should consider implementing this kind of magic in their games and creative writing. Not only can consideration of less powerful implementations of magic make the world feel more whimsical, it can also serve as a mechanism by which the world builder fleshes out the systems of magic on the whole. Having a solid grasp of the mechanics of magic can, likewise, inform a storyteller and aid them in their writing or game creation. I hope that this video has served as a catalyst for your creative ventures. Go out and make your world more magical, and remember to keep in mind the vast-reaching implications of magic on a world. Or don't, I'm not your real mom. If you'd like to support my creative ventures, go ahead and click those buttons below the video and maybe they will somehow cast an incredibly minor spell upon the YouTube algorithm. Or maybe they'll fizzle, who knows.